Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of HerStory, where we sit and talk and have conversations with our Indigenous sisters from across various countries to talk about things that are possibly, get swept away in the larger conversations. This is a series of dialogues that is going to be focused on Indigenous women and the various issues and intersections that concern them. And for our very first episode, we have Makepeace, who's an independent journalist who's currently based out of Northeast India, Guwahati city, where she covers a series and a spectrum of indigenous issues. And her stories obviously are, widely published by international publications like Al Jazeera and various other mainstream publications in India as well. And also we have Athing with us, who is volunteering with the Naga Women's Union based out of Manipur, who's going to give us a wider perspective about women and issues from the structural point of view. And of course, I'm joined by my colleague as well, Pragyaa, who is the Indigenous Women's Coordinator at Asia Indigenous Peoples Bank. So happy to have all of you here today to discuss today's theme, which is the first episode which we're opening with, which is violence and indigenous women, and the very, many aspects and nuances of how violence, whether it's structural, community, domestic, all of those sort of areas and layers of discrimination affect indigenous women. The reason that Makepeace is here today is because she's done a fabulous documentary for Vice, taking a look at two protagonists. Correct me if I'm wrong, Makepeace, was it two protagonists from both from indigenous communities in Northeast India? It's what is it called? Can you just let me know the title of your documentary?
It's called Witches in Exile, or I think it's more if you look up like witches and vice on YouTube, you should find it. What it means.
So it's basically a look at traveling and journeying with two indigenous women who are the protagonists of this documentary, and they've been accused of doing witchcraft, and then the sort of documentary looks at what happens to their lives as a result of being ostracized by the communities and also being boycotted by government and government policies, which is something which is quite unfortunately common, which is not just common to Northeast India, which is across the region, I suppose, when it comes to indigenous women, especially with reference to Southeast Asia and South Asia in terms of the geopolitics. So Makepeace, just tell me, like, just to clarify, like, what is a witch in the context of indigenous cultures? I'm sure people have a very sort of colorful idea of what a witch is, but if you could just sort of break it down for us.
I think, the definition of what or who a witch is in some sense quite universal, and it doesn't, entirely take a very different meaning, even in, sort of the indigenous cultures, at least, which are kind of bordering South Asia and Southeast Asia. So I do look at Northeast India much in that sort of, periphery of both these large subcontinents or subcontinents, right? So I, at least in both in my reading as well as my reporting, the kind of belief or the kind of superstitions, if you want to call it, that are attached to a witch is the same as someone who is primarily, of course, evil, or who does not have the best of intentions, who's out to sort of sort of either corrupt or basically poison the society or the community or the village or whatever at large. So it's not even a very sort of singular person or kind of a family necessarily that she again would be attacking, or that she would have a grouse against. So she's seen as someone who's a threat to the society, to the community at large. So, and yes, there are of course a lot of like magical kind of connotations that are attached to that. She's capable of like sort of whatever, making people sick, if there is an epidemic of any sorts going on, like either like sort of malaria, or like typhoid or something like that, or Japanese encephalitis. These are very, again, common epidemics, which are very which happen almost on an annual basis in many parts of, in fact, the Northeast, right? So, and these are attributed to them. Again, bad crops would be attributed to them and not necessarily the season or, the seasonal rains or climate change and things like that. So any kind of, a bad kind of occurrence that befalls the community or a village is essentially the handiwork of the witch, who is conspiring, and someone who's doing it surely out of spite. And yeah,
right.
So I think the definition is somewhat
but the thing is that also this is not something inorganic to indigenous cultures, right? Like, I think also there is perhaps this parallel system of healthcare, perhaps. Do you think that people come to them to seek medical attention in the absence of proper healthcare, maybe in these regions which are so remote? Do you think they also serve a sort of need in society?
No, absolutely they do, because I mean that is that is also what that is also the belief, the system. I mean, you have to understand that a lot of these places, many of which would also be somewhat accessible to modern healthcare, are still living in a slightly paganistic kind of a belief system, whether they may be embedded into either organized religions like Hinduism or like even Christianity or even Buddhism to that extent, right? Paganistic beliefs, however, still remain. So yes, I mean, but the difference that I've seen is that like both men and women practice this kind of sort of, what do you call, traditional medicine or some sort of sorcery, something like that, right? But what I have seen is that with at least when it comes to a male or a male witch doctor or a male traditional healer, he or she would be renowned, to the extent that he's very public in his image, and his image would precede him. He either makes like home visits, or for that matter, there's a huge crowd that kind of gathers around him, and there's a huge attendance that he receives, right? Sometimes, in fact, to the extent of even even the official elected public leaders. I can give you the example of one particular traditional healer in my own hometown, which is, I think, who is like, stone's throw away from where my parents live, right? And at least pre-corona, like, he had a whole thriving business going on, and all he does is he has no medicines or anything like that. He's believed to have a healing touch, right? So with every person that he attends to, and he gives an average about, like, say, 5 seconds to even 5 minutes per person, and he just touches them in certain parts of their body or something, and people believe that it has a healing effect and all that. So to the extent that even
which is interesting, because when you look at, like, you're bringing about like the gender disparity, and you're looking at how men are not stigmatized. On the other hand, somebody like a witch, I suppose, in a feminist construct, is somebody who has agency and somebody who has the ability to change things, and therefore she's also stigmatized in that way, that she's this woman who can bring about change, whether good or bad.
So that's a contrast I was building, that because I mean that's something that I've seen at least in my own hometown, right? Whereas this guy has access, and he has a photograph of like even the CM Biren Singh, like coming to or whatever,
he's got political sanction, is what you're saying, as well as social sanction
also. But then the few women that I know, both back at home as well as that I've seen in in the state where I live, Assam, it's a very kind of a confidential, it's very discreet, the way that people come to them, the way that people tend to them. Again, there's something which is very common in folklore. You must have seen that the woman, or the woman traditional healer, as they say, she would be somewhat like a lone wolf. Quite like she is single either by choice, or that she's sort of widowed, or like or she's divorced, separated from her husband, or something like that. or she lives like at the edge of the, the village or
Society, right,
outcast.
on the fabric of society.
So it's the same
Which,
skill set, it's the same service, but the reception is very different.
which brings me to the question, like, I'm going to like pose to Pragyaa and Ating. You guys have worked with Indigenous women for many years. You understand at the community, you understand at the policy level, how women are ostracized. What are the various, like, examples, like case studies that you've seen? For example, this is obviously one of them, where society ostracizes women by calling them witches. What are the other ways that you could sort of highlight and say, the kinds of discrimination that women face, particularly Indigenous women, in communities which are obviously themselves on the margins of mainstream society, away from dominant cultures? Are we obviously, at the receiving end of historical oppressions and, of course, state-sanctioned violence? How does that sort of break it down, and how does it boil down to women in let's say communities or otherwise?
Okay, yeah. I think Indigenous women, particularly, we face triple discrimination in nurture. We are discriminated at a structural level, at a community level, and at a domestic level. Because we are indigenous and also we are marginalized. Like excommunication in our community is not based on gender as such, but somebody who has committed a crime, and when there is a social sanction that is not acceptable by the society, those people or individual are ostracized. Otherwise, I cannot say that this is really based on gender.
Right. What are the sort of activities that you think would invite ostracization or excommunication? Like, for example, can you just give me some examples of why societies would do that?
Recently, I think it's more of a political. In the olden days, might be a different reason, but I think the recent instances that we have is more of a political than individual issues. Like, for example, when somebody says something that is not acceptable to the society or which is against our principle or our accepted terms, those people are taken up by the general public, and then there is the decision made.
Which is interesting, because I looked at your documentary also, Makepeace, and I was just going to ask you if there is a more insidious, taking a cue from what Ating is saying, that it is usually in this current context more politically motivated. Do you think that perhaps that when these women, for example, the protagonists in your documentary, were ostracized, was it a more sinister move to grab their lands and resources? Do you think it's coming from that perspective as well? Where, let's say, somebody in the community has an eye on their land and...
I think, to the extent that I have, reported on this, I can say that surely land is at the, is really at the heart of this conflict, right? Or rather this, no, I wouldn't even call it a conflict or something. It's literally an oppression. But at least as far as I've read and sort of researched into this, most of this contestation or fight is more interpersonal, or it's at least within the community. So I won't be able to say or comment, and I don't think to the extent that at least I've seen or read, even in news reports, there has been a larger, design by the state or the powers that be to kind of use this as a tool to kind of, grab land or, sort of evict people, I don't think this is something that, it very well, it's quite plausible, of course. It's something that cannot entirely be ruled out, because it's very common when indigenous lands are grabbed or are occupied. It always is through some sort of a dalali that happens, right? And that the dalal is someone within the community. That's a tried and tested formula from colonial times, of course. But yeah, not in this case that I've seen so far.
Pragyaa, do you also, have you also seen something like this where there are sort of kangaroo courts, for lack of a better term, in indigenous communities, where there is a set of people who are self-appointed in a sort of unofficial manner, where they sort of take decisions at the community level for people? Is that replicated in Nepal as well?
Yes, actually, there are a lot of courts like that where they just make up, it's mostly made up of men in the rural communities where they decide on people's lives, etc. So I think it's quite common in a more, let's say, a rural setting with and very low literacy rate, etc. No? So I think it's quite interesting when Ating was also saying that Indigenous women, of course, face multiple layers of discrimination. That is one kind of these unofficial courts, let's say. These are one kind of structural violence against women,
Yeah, parallel
especially
justice
Indigenous
systems.
women. Yeah. So I wanted to ask Ating, no? Since she has been working as an Indigenous women's rights activist since many, many years, also with us in Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. Um, how do you think I think no the prevalence of domestic violence in your community, or what kind of domestic violence do you see more in your community?
Domestic violence is rampant, but most commonly is related to alcohol-related violence. Comparatively, we have less violence relating to property or inheritance right, but on drug and alcohol, it's very common. So as a women's organization, what we have in each villages, we have our own unit who are in fact who are looking after such kinds of preventive measure against violence against alcohol related or any kinds of violence in the village. And we work with a village authority. Like I said in the earlier, we have the structural violence. So going back to the kangaroo court, I think we have definitely our customary court where decisions or any cases relating to violence are all taken by men. There is no woman representative in the rural court or in our justice what you call institution where decision can be taken. No? So I think the one way we have also challenged this kind of structural violence is by I can say that we are a little bit innovative in a way. We have created our own platform or institutions, like where in each of our villages we have our own women's unit. So that is one way of how we also challenge the structural violence in our community, because we're so much dominated by patriarchal system that sometimes we also we're so used to it and we don't know how to respond. But I think one good way of responding to this structural violence is creating our own platform, having our own voice, having our own agenda, and also definitely that is where also like a man dominated institution also, I mean, invited our institution and put us in an equal footing. So that is also one way of how we also are really bargaining with a kind of the power structure in our community.
In terms of civil society, when, let's say, a woman is a victim of domestic violence, what is the first sort of area of like a safe space? Where does she have an access to a safe space? Do organizations like yours, for example, provide these safe spaces to domestic violence victims, for example? What are the ways forward? If, let's say, somebody who's been a domestic violence victim, most of the times what happens is that they end up not having a parallel
to go, you mean.
support system,
Mhm.
outside of family. Usually what happens is that, they'll keep her for maybe a few days, and then they'll say, oh, it's okay, you'll have to adjust, go back to your husband. At the end of the day, you have children and this and that. So, I mean, in the absence of obviously a structural support system outside the institution of marriage and family, where do these women go then? What are their options available?
Yeah,
I think
I think, Nina, that's a very big problem, no, everywhere. Like I can tell you in my experience in Nepal, I worked with the survivors of gender-based violence for last 13, 14 years.
Mhm.
So there's always it's the last resort, let's say, for a woman to go out of home,
Mhm.
to escape the situation. And when she does, there's very limited space. You can go, she can go to the hospital, she can go to the police, but they can't keep her for like days or months.
Right.
Right. So there are few safe shelters in Nepal, I can say. And also it's increasing, the government is really trying to increase the number of safe houses for these women and provide them rehabilitation services, etc. But the issue is it's mostly in the bazaars, no? It's mostly in a very centrally located space. So there's a big discussion on how the women in the really remote areas can access to these places. So there have been few interventions where they try to establish these kind of safe spaces inside the village,
Mhm.
and run by the women in the village. But I haven't seen it replicated a lot. Um, yeah, it is very important for a woman who has suffered from violence to have this safe space.
Access to safe spaces, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is coming back to Makepeace. What were like, it's not just the woman obviously who's been impacted by it, but I suppose her family as well. So when she's, she's physically, of course, living in a space which is far away from the community, what happens to her family, for example, when she's been accused of something like that? Do they move with her, or do they continue staying back in the community because they own that piece of land or whatever, and they don't want to like live somewhere else? What happens?
No, most often the entire family is banished. So, I mean, it's literally like being accused of, practicing witchcraft or being a witch is a curse that befalls the entire family.
Right.
So, right. What I've seen is the entire family being impacted meaning either, sort of being driven out of their homes, or essentially also being, sort of mobbed or lynched or slaughtered.
Attacked
In
also and killed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's literally, I mean, it's also reinforcing that same idea, that very mainland Indian idea of, sort of being the honor of the family or carrying the burden of honor of the family, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, it's I feel like this kind of this whole modus operandi of, kind of this collective punishment to a family for the supposed wrong of one member, and I mean, of course, the female member of the family, is a, cautionary tale for all other women to not, sort of transgress or not sort of step out of their own Lakshman
Boundaries.
Rekha, if you will.
Mhm.
Yeah, so
It's also a way, I suppose, of making them an example, right? To kind of
absolutely, exactly, yeah.
to prevent other people from doing that. But the point is that their very presence is there because there's somebody obviously reaching out to them from the community, and there's some need that they're clearly addressing, like you said. I mean, men on the other hand, they're sort of valorized for these qualities, and women on the other hand are completely, there's a completely different story. It's just the opposite, for them. Does this sort of violence that is perpetrated by let's say community also directed at children, for example, who are part of that family structure?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really, I mean, when the collective punishment happens, and then obviously there is enough, like there's enough, like, let's say, this kind of image that's built around the family being of being sort of evil or being someone who has conspired to kind of, basically whatever, either like, sort of destroy the entire village in some sense. So even, I mean, even children are not really spared in this punishment.
Yeah, I mean, Pragyaa, for example, like, I don't know, like, in Nepal, like, Ating said that that's one of the ways that structural violence permeates into society is, its impact is alcoholism, rampant drug abuse. Do you see similar patterns in Nepal as well, like among the men in the community, for example?
Oh, yes. Alcohol and drug abuse, especially in the areas where there's it's bordering to India. There's a lot of cases of drug abuse, no? And then these young men, they get into this addiction, and then they start beating their wives, etc. And then I have even seen cases like the husbands, making the wife's life hell, asking her money every time, wouldn't let her work. And then he wanted to go to the rehabilitation center, for which the wife had to take all these loans, which she could not repay. All these kind of issues are very rampant here in Nepal as well, and of course the alcohol use. But here, I think we have to see alcohol and drugs not as the cause.
Symptom.
There's something inside these men's head and beliefs that is like triggered by alcohol. You can blame alcohol, you can blame drugs.
I mean,
and
obviously,
everything,
I'm sure there are several studies around this where,
Right.
You're looking at historically oppressed people, you're looking at structural violence in the
Yes.
sense that, there's militarization. Like, for example, in Manipur, there's been, decades of military presence, and the impact that it, has on families and communities and those sort of things. There's also unemployment, which is another structural issue that leads to a lot of these, addictions and coping mechanisms. I think, like, you talked about a lot of men's, organizations and, these sort of parallel justice systems. What kind of solutions do these men offer? Men who are, when you're talking about the conversation that men and men have, it's also important to look at that, because it ultimately also impacts women and children. So when there are these, there's cases of addiction in communities, how do these men's organizations, for example, deal with them? Or does is there a collective sort of responsibility? How are they kind of addressed, these addiction problems, by civil society, let's say, by representatives of civil society?
Aside from NGOs, I think civil societies, not much attention is paid to this drugs and alcohol. No?
I wanted to ask Nina and Makepeace, is there any legislation, law, bills in India against witchcraft?
Yes, but the thing is that most of them are from the colonial times, so they really haven't sort of undergone a revision as such. So when you're looking at, for example, the legal justice system in India, it's predominantly a hangover from colonial times, which is, we're still dealing with antiquated laws, like not, for example, recognizing marital rape, for example. Not understanding the nuances of consent, for example. Those are the conversations which are just sort of opening up. Even when it comes to, let's say, LGBTQ, the laws that are, they're also, of course, grappling with the same colonial situations. But one of the biggest issues, of course, is the question of marital rape, which is not recognized legally. We just had a hearing. I think we just had one of the high courts, I'm forgetting which one, which just said that, it's not illegal for a man to have sexual intercourse with his wife, possibly. So you're looking at these conversations happening in the 21st century. And these are conversations that are from obviously mainstream dominant culture. So you can imagine how that kind of has an impact on already marginalized people, right? In terms of things. So, I mean, you have the triple discrimination. You have the patriarchal norms. I can give you my example. For example, I come from a matrilineal, indigenous community, who are the Garos from Meghalaya. And, one would think that, of course, in comparison to, let's say, mainstream Indian society, which is feudal, patriarchal, all of those things, in comparison, let's say women have more economic, stability, access, they can, work, they can earn and all of those things. Does that then mean that they are in decision-making roles, which is not the case? Which is again what I think was saying is that men at the end of the day are still making decisions for women, even in matrilineal societies. Who they choose to marry, whether there's some sort of a discrepancy, in terms of settling marriages, in terms of family disputes, in terms of property disputes, it's always the men who are at the end of the day, taking a call on these things. So which is why, I kind of, we lost connection with you, I think. So I was just, if you could just continue in the same way, and because, these are obviously things that cannot be addressed in isolation, right? Like violence is very much a part of what society is, how we kind of tend to look at it, and therefore it must be addressed from civil society as well, not just have an external source of people who kind of come and tell people what to do. I think from a more granular cellular space, I think it needs to be addressed from within the society as such. Why are the men not taking a more active role, do you think? I mean, I see them taking active roles, for example, in other issues like settling property disputes and other things.
Yeah,
but why
exactly.
are they not willing to kind of address these things?
I don't know the reason why men are shying away from taking a role in controlling alcohol or a drug. Because in Manipur, I think we will see that cultivation, for example, cultivation of opium is like rampant. And of course, this is related to partly related to livelihood issue also, but also I think drug manufacturing is also quite often, and these are people with strong nexus, political and even arms. So I think men don't want to step into this kind of control. I mean, into this kind of risks maybe. But I think they also need to study more about, consider more about the damage that is being meted out by community. For example, the burden of this is borne by women, and we are left to defend ourselves. For example, we are producer. Indigenous women are the producer, we are the provider, we tend the kids, we attend the domestic calls. On top of that, we face violence where men just don't seem to bother on these issues, no?
Okay, just quickly before we wrap up, I want like recommendations on how to deal with this. I'm going to like obviously take it first, I think if you could just leave us with your sort of insights as to how to kind of tackle these issues. What would you suggest from, like, let's say, deeper involvement in society, for example? What would be your recommendations in sort of dealing with the violence, the many layered violence that we face?
Yeah, I think my recommendation would be, like, for example, when we talk about redressing the needs or also attending the needs, we know that it's best to be attended by people who are close to them at the community level or at the village level. So for in our context, it is our women's institution who can attend to their needs, who can understand the kind of sufferings they undergo. But I think it's also the state should be more forthcoming. For example, we have the Women Commission, and we don't know about the international mechanism, the laws of the state. So a lot of awareness need to be created. Otherwise, we're just left alone. Most of the time, when women suffer violence or when there has to be a decision by men alone and not by her representing herself or represented by women. What does it? I think it's time that the state forces, including the the Women Commission, need to be more empowered, and they also need to do a lot more. They need to reach out more to the people. They need to tie up more to women bodies who are doing on this kind of who are dealing with this kind of issues. NGOs who are dealing with this kind of, and they need a collaboration. I think just one institution will not do, but we need a lot of forces together to deal with this kind of.
Coming to you, Makepeace, what do you think? Do you think, of course, there is always the question of, a sort of feminist solidarity among women, because what I see is that, the way that patriarchy functions is pitting women against women most of the times in communities, right? Where there is a sort of a power structure where, let's say, older women are more, sort of looked at as enablers of the patriarchal system because they're benefiting from it. And the younger ones, on the other hand, there's a generational gap as well, where, they're at the receiving end of it. So do you think that more sort of intersectional feminist solidarity is also required within a more granular space?
I mean, yeah, certainly. I think that there isn't any other way, right? There isn't, I mean, there are options. Yes, there are, we can say we need to sort of, resort to, or we should always kind of, hang on to the rule of the law, or the law of the land, basically the authorities, the police authorities, to kind of solve this. I think I'll just give an example, like at least what from my reporting. So there of course, the Sam Police had also sort of, started off a program, I think somewhere very early in the 2000s, to kind of, nip this whole kind of, which basically nip the whole controversy from building up around witch hunting and things like that, right? So it was quite I think it was quite an ingenious idea, at least as a concept, right, by a former DGP, to kind of, like raise awareness, get people engaged in, like, more productive activities, if you can say, like, get them to build some wells and all that, because a lot of the issues were, developmental, or the lack thereof. I mean, if you can say, even perhaps more related to even the local municipality and all of those things. But governance, of course, the issue again, I think where it was successful to some extent was that because the governance in a lot of tribal areas come under one or the other schedule. So they come under these territorial councils, right? And as we also know, the territorial councils have essentially been a very failed concept in the Northeast. I mean, given that, it's some sort of like relative autonomy without really giving the full autonomy to, local sort of administrators. It's mostly been a, ground rife with just corruption and, again, abuse of power. But I mean, with that background in mind, the police had done some amount with some success, kind of just raising awareness and using aggressive awareness building to stop witch hunts or whatever, this kind of thing, rumors from gaining popularity. Yet what I find is that, what like an organization like Biro Bala Mission has done, and they've been working along with, sort of more mainstream women's rights organizations, like either Anything or, for that matter, like, the Guwahati-based ones as well, and of course, these Guwahati-based organizations have more direct connect with the UN organizations and other international organizations, right? So Biro Bala Mission has, I felt, although they have also tackled awareness to some extent, where they've got these, theater groups and all of that, and staging plays, and these are all from the community, right? So you have these girls, these young women staging, young women and men staging these plays, but they're I think they're sort of, their intervention, their timely intervention, when things get really serious, and well, I mean, there's an active witch hunt going on, and at least in preventing, these families from being slaughtered or from lynched, has been, I think, I would still say it has been the most effectual, at least in the longer run, So the other models, the police model, while admirable in concept, on letter, or on paper, but I mean, I don't think it's a necessarily limitation of the concept. It's just because of the limitation also of governance and politics, which kind of comes into hand. But which is where I say that I think intersectional feminism, which also I understand, especially when it gets down to organizations and things. I mean, a lot of bureaucracy does come in there, and there's a lot of international politics as well as local domestic politics that does come in. That does come in the way of things, of doing the good work. Yet that has, I feel, I mean, even today, if you go to many of the areas where, even including, let's say, Boro areas in Assam, I mean, Birubala is the name for all of these people, she is.
So you're saying that's a model that needs to be replicated?
I think that is the model that has just been most effectual. I mean, I don't think I'm in a position, and I haven't, studied this long to be able to kind of give a very strong recommendation. But from my limited, reading of things, she's been someone who's found most resonance, because I think it's also her ability to, at the end of the day, the message coming in from the powers that be in authorities, and also an authority where, someone else from another ethnicity is kind of telling you, talking down to you, is always different than another indigenous woman coming and speaking to you, and training women in the community as well to become like, and that's exactly the message that we had also put in the documentary, that, one Birubala, and Birubala currently is actually not very, very well, like, she's quite old as well. So, but one Birubala is certainly not enough, right? You need several Birubalas. So force that those several Birubalas, I mean, nothing but intersectional feminism that's going to really come to rescue.
Right. Pragyaa, what are your recommendations from your years of working with Indigenous women? What do you see as the way forward at the policy level, at the community level?
Yeah, I just want to add two things to what Ating and Makepeace have already said. So the first thing is we need to engage more men and boys.
Yes.
To this.
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
We need their partnership. So we cannot fight it alone. We have to bring them on board. So a lot of engagement of the men and boys should be done in the interventions and whatever we.
That sensitization.
Right. And the second one is I strongly recommend the donor agencies or international organizations to increase their funding to the Indigenous women's organizations who are trying to fight this from their own community levels. So these are the two things that I would recommend.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this wonderful first episode of HerStory. It was really insightful, and I hope that many of our viewers who listen to it and watch this episode can take some key actionable points from this. Thank you, everyone.